Oh yeah, oh yeah. What's happening, everybody? Just turning some things off here so they don't interfere with my bandwidth. All right, so we could probably just get started right away. Hope everyone is doing well. Hope you guys are safe, healthy, happy. Rough times out there, huh? Rough times indeed. So if you are new to this, if you haven't done one of these before, pretty much every time we come out with a new guild project, we are trying to do these watch parties. And a watch party is nothing more than showing the first couple of videos for free. So you can kind of get an idea what the lessons will entail. If you're new to the guild, you can see what the guild is like, the level of detail that the videos provide, and it gives you an idea of what this project is going to look like. So sometimes with these projects we don't quite know until we're like actually building it. So this gives you a better idea what the value proposition is, and it's also a great way to just hang out with people, especially at a time right now. I think we could probably use this sense of community with other people around the world, and yeah, again, tough times. So without further ado, I will play the videos. Now I have two of them. One is an introduction video, and remember, the guild is about the long game. We actually talk a lot. We actually explain things and spend some time with concepts. So the introduction is a little bit of a virtual tour to show you kind of where the project's going, where the drawing is at, and where it's headed. And in the second video, we're going to get into some of the construction of a wooden ring. I have it around here somewhere because I'm not actually done with the project, but the first one is about 8 minutes long-ish, and the second one is maybe 20 minutes long. So about 30 minutes of elapsed time for this if you're on a tight schedule. One last note. Things don't always work perfectly when I put video into the live stream like this. So at some point, if the lip sync is not perfect, there's nothing I can do about it. It happens all the time, but it doesn't usually take away from the comprehension of the topic. All right. So I'm going to hit play on this. I will be in the chat room, you guys. So if you want to ask questions or say hello, do that in the chat room. All right. So let's do this. Let's look at this intro. Welcome everybody to the nesting tables build. This is the set of nesting tables that actually inspired this build. So years ago, Nicole came home from TJ Maxx or Home Goods or one of those stores with a set of nesting tables, and it had 3 tables nested within each other. I don't know what happened to the smallest one, but I do have 2. Now this smaller table here, this one is not in terrible shape. It's actually, it's a little bit uneven, but at least it works. This one, on the other hand, this has seen a better day. So I think it's just dowel construction, and like a lot of manufactured furniture, they may not have used enough adhesive and it's kind of fallen apart. So we really liked the design, thought it was pretty cool, but years ago I wanted to make a slightly improved version of this, and I made a table for my mom. And that's this guy here. So went with a different species of wood. I got walnut and alder, which is a really nice combination. Pretty much copied the outside design. It's exactly the same, but I did add a little bit of a reveal in here, so it's not just kind of flush all the way across. That adds a nice little dimension to it. And of course I have a thicker top with a little bit of a chamfer design on there. So I thought this was an improved version, but it is, make no mistake about it, it's a copy. I basically just copied the exact same design here on the side panel. So when I make one for this guild build, I really wanted to do something different, because it's okay if you copy something and you give it to your mom, but copying it and then distributing that to a bunch of people, you should come up with something a little bit more unique, right? So I went to a couple of friends of mine that are much better at design than I am. You see, the problem is I've been looking at these tables for so long. When I sat down with a pencil and paper to try to make something different, I could not get this design out of my head. So I went to 2 people who don't suffer from that problem and got some really cool ideas. One of them is very elaborate, and I don't think it's appropriate for this particular build, and one is a little bit more simplified. But let's head to the office, crack open the SketchUp file, and I'll show you the 2 versions and then give you an idea of where this project's going to go. So I had a few goals with my initial design. First of all, I wanted to beef up the legs. So you can see in this preliminary sketch here, I have thicker legs. They're pretty much a square at this point. That just gives us more creative options. It makes the table a little bit sturdier. You have a situation here where this smaller table is going to be removable, right? So if that's going to slide out and you don't have as much support here in the legs, it's really important that we have good quality mortise and tenon joints up here to hold this structure together. So I thought thicker legs would give us that option. I also thought this would be a cool opportunity for some kind of a floating top. And you could see when I do things like this, I don't really sketch it all out just yet. This is something that it's a detail that we could add in later. This bottom one here has the detail as it's sketched out in the future. But you could see initially when I draw this stuff in SketchUp, I don't worry too much about the details. I just want an accurate representation for the height. So you could see that there's a little bit of a gap here. So we might do something different with this top, but this was a really good starting point. And this was also the point at which I would send this to Brian and say, hey dude, help me out here. Do you have any ideas for what we can do with this side panel area? And boy, did he have some ideas. And just a little inspiration for you. Here's an interesting sort of grid work pattern with a solid zebra wood panel that would look really cool. This one's just, you could just see he's just kind of noodling with different ideas and different designs for this. This is kind of cool. It's kind of like a sun and moon sort of situation going on there. This one's very minimalist. And then another cool grid work design. And after a while, this is what Brian came up with that I liked the most. And it's a very cool idea where you have some of these vertical pieces of walnut that are just kind of captured in the center disc, and a lot of cool elements just kind of playing around with this design. So I like this so much that I actually decided to start building part of it and see how feasible it would be to make this ring and disc and how that would all pan out. So you'll see a couple of pictures here of things that I did. I basically made the measurements and assembled a segmented ring. I turned that ring so it's a perfect circle of the dimension that I needed. And then I was able to resaw and create a situation where I could drop a little disc inside. And this became fairly complicated because I needed to drop a disc inside of a groove, and the only way to create that groove that I could find was to slice the ring and create a rabbet on the inside and then glue that ring back together with the panel in place. So anyway, this was successful. The problem was it didn't do what I wanted to do with regard to the nested position. I really want this thing to do something cool when the two tables are put together. And this disc is just so big and bulky that it blocks everything going on the internal table. The only thing you could do with the inside table is repeat that pattern, and I don't know that was the effect that I was really looking for. So then I had a conversation with our web designer, John Funk, who happens to be a pretty good artist, and we were talking about the two-dimensional appearance. So he started to draft out some two-dimensional figures showing me what these things might look like, how they could be complementary, but then also do something together that kind of makes sense, visually. So that's what we have here, the two pieces separated, and you could see they're very similar, but they do different things, and they occupy different space, so that when you nest them together, you actually get a concentric ring sort of look, and that the tops and the gaps between these things all sort of even out. So what I was able to do then was to go back to SketchUp and make this thing kind of a reality. And if you look at it, it's kind of crazy when you're viewing it from the side as these concentric rings move through the two pieces. But I try to retain even gaps between visual elements here. So whether this works in real life or not, we'll see what it turns out like. But this was a cool starting point that you could take that sort of two-dimensional concept and bring it into what would be a nice, interesting 3D reality. And from there, I decided that the legs could use a little bit more flair, literally, and I flared out the bottom a little bit, giving them that sort of bell-bottom look, although this image is a little more aggressive than what I eventually wound up doing. But it started with that, and then I quickly decided we might want to go with something that's more of a symmetrical shape. So in our final design, you can kind of see how those elements all come together. The legs are now symmetrical from top to bottom. They bow in and then bow back out. Our horizontal rails here, they give you a nice raised platform there for the top to live on. And when viewed from the side, we have these two designs where essentially we'll create concentric circles, and then the pieces of this outside design are not interfering but complementing the pieces of the inner design. Now, one thing I want to bring your attention to real quick is the thickness of our rings here, also this cross piece. I didn't realize as I designed it in SketchUp that they were just too thick. I couldn't see it. But when I had it in person, I did see it, and you'll see a video
several videos in where I make that discovery and decide to use my drum sander to thin these pieces down even after the joinery has been cut. Now, your plans will show exactly the number I think looks best. That's 5/8 of an inch thick for both of these pieces, as well as this ring here. But you'll see that transition in the video as I make that discovery and make a design change on the fly. All right, so for now, this is the design we are going to push forward with. There certainly could be a couple little changes here and there, but I like where this is going, right? The design looks good with the tables apart, and I think it looks good with the tables together, and they are sort of harmonious. Maybe a little bit crowded, but you're generally going to leave these pieces in some state of disassembly like this, either partially, as you see in this photo, or fully apart in two different locations. So either way, I think we got a good design to start with, so we can jump right in.
All right, so that was the first part, the introduction. Everyone's asking about the April Fool's joke that we tried to play on our kids. It didn't pan out, so we were going to try to dim all the lights in the house, close the curtains, try to make it darker than it really was, and convince them that it was bedtime 2 hours early. And then once it's clear that they're not really tired, like one of two things would happen. They'd either go to sleep, and it would be like, score, win for, the parents, or they would resist, and, within about 5 or 10 minutes, we would be like, just kidding. And Ava she hasn't seen anyone in a long time, so she saw the neighbors, and from a very safe distance, she was outside talking for like an hour. So what are you gonna do? All right, so here's a little preview of where we're headed. This is one of the walnut wooden rings that we're gonna make. Probably a lot of different ways you could construct this. What I opted to do was a segmented ring, and the video we're gonna watch now is about the assembly of that. Now the next video after this, which we will not see tonight, but that will be released tomorrow for folks who purchase the project, goes into actually creating the ring, the 3/4 inch ring itself. But right now we're going to do a segmented assembly, and you'll see the rough turning and all that stuff, right? So yeah, let's just get into it. Oh, do you need a lathe? No, Paul. This video that I'm going to show you right now shows you two ways to do it. There are other ways you can accomplish this. I'm going to show it on the lathe, and then I'm going to show using a circle template. And you could either make that template, or we actually have them for sale. But those are two different methods that I recommend. There's other ways to do it. You could, worst case scenario, draw the circle, cut it out, and then sand back to your line. It won't be absolutely perfect, but it could still work. All right? So let's dig in, yo! Now, anytime I start a new project, I like to try to break it down into phases, right? And a lot of times it makes sense to work on one thing before you work on this other thing. Some things are dependent on one another, and it just makes sense to do them in a certain order. In the case of this table, we actually can start wherever we want, but we do have three things. We have a top that we need to make, we have a base structure consisting of legs and rails, and then we have this side decorative element. Now for me, without a doubt, the most difficult part is going to be the side element, so I personally like to handle the hardest things first, get them done and over with, and then I can kind of just cruise through the rest of the project. So that's where I'm going to start. Now that side design that I'm working with, I guess the first place we should begin there is with the walnut ring. And you should think about this ring, right? You could take a full piece of solid stock and just cut a ring out of that, but is that really the strongest way to go? Let me show you an example and show you why it isn't. Now I've drawn a ring on this wide piece of mahogany here just to show you what I'm talking about. All the grain is running this way. So if you look at these sides, this area here is going to be pretty strong. It would be hard to take this ring and break it in half because the grain is running across the area you're trying to break. But it's a very different story as we start to migrate around, and especially right here and right here. That's very weak. It would not take much pressure at all to take that ring and just snap it. So while this is a decorative piece, and it's not necessarily going to be subject to a lot of weight and strain, I do think it just makes a lot of sense to make this ring a little bit stronger. So how do we do that? Check out this bad boy. This is a segmented ring. So now what we've done is we've taken small pieces, mitered them on both sides, and glued them together to shape a ring. Now, we don't really have the grain running perfectly around the circumference, but it's pretty close, right? So each one of these pieces is running straight across this way. And in the end, if we do a little bit of milling to this ring or anything that puts strain on the ring, we've got a much better chance of it not kicking back, falling apart, or simply splitting just because the grain is running through the short dimension, right? So this is what we're going to have to figure out, is how many segments do we want, and what will the size of those segments be. Now I've decided on 8 segments just because any smaller than this, it just gets a little dicey working with little tiny pieces like that. So I'm gonna go with what will essentially be an octagon when we first make it. And if you do the math or you just Google this, 8 segments means each one of these miters has to be 22.5 degrees. That's just the way the math works out. But how big should these segments be to get the size rings that we need for the project? Now there may be a mathematical formula for this, but I don't know what that is, so I actually had to do this through trial and error, and I want you to know how to do this too. So even if it's a little bit more of a brute force method to figure this out, I'm going to show you what I do in SketchUp with a little bit of trial and error to figure out the exact length, thickness, and width of these segments.
So I'm going to show you one ring. This process applies to both of them. We'll start with the larger one. So first thing I need to do is figure out my minimums. In order to do that, I'm going to use the circle tool to draw two circle lines to essentially make our ring. So one will draw at a radius of 4.5, and that's a 9-inch diameter. And the next one I'll put in at 3.75, and that gives us our 7.5 inner diameter. Now if I break this up into 8 pieces, we can now take an overhead look and just kind of see what each one of these segments would be in length. So from corner to corner here, that's about 2 7/8, but we really need this to be longer, right? Think about it this way. We've got to extend these pieces out so that whenever we draw a line across here, it includes the outer section of that ring, right? Well, that's an awful representation. That's not even at all. But you can see what I mean. It gets longer here, right? So we're looking at pieces that are at least going to be 3 1/16 in length from there. Now to figure out how wide the piece would need to be, you could do something kind of similar. Draw from here to here. This thing would probably be more accurate if I did something like that. But anyways, width is going to be at least 15/16, so at least 1 inch, right? Now we need more buffer room than that, right? Because whatever we do to this thing, we're going to have to cut this ring out, turn it, route it, whatever it is. So we need more buffer room than this. So that's what we're going to do, is draw this thing using these numbers as a starting point, and I'm going to show you how what we end up with gives us the buffer zones that we need. So I'm going to go right to the number that I know works and show you how I figured this out. Just understand I had to do this 2 or 3 times to come up with the right figures that make sense for me. So I know my segments are going to be 3 7/8 long and 1.5 wide. So I just made this guy a component so that I could work within that. And if I can get my protractor tool here, I'm going to go 22.5 degrees that way. Same thing on this side. And we'll make those miter cuts now. And now we have one of our segments. So now if we grab this piece, we can copy and paste it. Bring our corners together here. And then we rotate this piece so it slides right in. We'll add another piece the same way. And now we're actually starting to assemble this whole thing. So it's a little bit tedious to go through this process, and I'm sure someone better at SketchUp and better at math would have a different way to do this, but this is the best way I could come up with. So I'm going to continue to assemble this thing, rotating the pieces as I go. Final piece goes in, and we've got our octagon. So in my test runs, the way that I determined if this actually fit was I would take the first ring that we constructed, clean it up and get rid of the stuff I don't need. And now I will simply drop this in place on top. All right, so if I bring it all the way to the edge, you can see I still have room over to the right, so this could do with a little centering. And that's all I'm looking for. I want to make sure that the ring that we make fits within this blank with a little bit of room on the back, a little bit of room on the inside, and that gives me some flexibility for how I actually turn or route this thing to final size. So after a little trial and error, you get the right size. Same thing for the smaller ring. I did the same exact process, but we've got these numbers there for you. You don't have to think about it, but I did want to make sure you understood how sometimes it's just trial and error measuring these things out to get the right answer, and then you move on.
So now that we know the dimension of our segments, we can grab some stock, whatever length we happen to have, and start to mill it up to size.
The rings start as simple 8/4 stock, milled to a final thickness of 1 3/4 and a width of 1 1/2. The length will vary depending on which ring we're making.
So how do we cut these miters? Well, you got a couple different ways to do it. I've got a Incra Miter 5000. This is just a fancy, expensive pre-made sled, but it works really well because it's got a built-in miter gauge set up there. So all I really need to do for this, given its accuracy, is to go to my gauge and set it at 22.5. 22.5 actually happens to be one of the settings that you will find on most miter gauges that get to a certain degree, like this one does. So 22.5 right there. This is pretty much ready to go. There are other ways to do it though. Of course, if you have a miter saw, that's one option. Just watch your fingers and make sure you could secure your work. And check out this little device here. This is called a miter set. I've never really used it before. The gentleman sent me one. And I just haven't had the opportunity, but it's a very impressive little setup jig. So you see all these numbers in here. This corresponds to the number of segments you want in a ring. So if you want 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, in this case we want 8 segments. We're going to put 1 pin on the 8 and 1 pin in the starter hole. You grab any miter gauge, drop it in, and then adjust your fence so that it's on those 2 pins. Check that out. And now you know you are locked in at, it doesn't tell you what the degree is, but we do know it's 22.5 degrees. So that's a very reasonable setting. I've got no affiliation with these guys, but I just think it's a great tool, especially if you're doing a lot of segmented things and segmented turnings, something to consider, all right? So now that we're set up for the cut, we can start making our cuts here at the sled. It's not a bad idea to do a practice run, right? Because you are going to want to check these angles when you're done, and you don't want to use your good material to do it. Now, before we get going here, just a couple of things to note. First of all, you want a good, reliable stop block. That's crucial. If we don't get our segments exactly the same length, we're dead in the water. It's not going to work. So I'm going to also grab a ruler here, go against that stop block. And my second line here, this happens to be the actual cut line for the 0 clearance. And I got that guy set to my first size, that's 3 7/8. And when you adjust for the smaller ring, it's the same exact process. So one word of warning here, make sure that your fence is not in the way. You can have your sacrificial fence be cut, but the aluminum that's behind it, make sure you scoot that over so it doesn't get cut. Another thing I'm going to look for is squareness to the surface, right? So bring in a square onto your fence, make sure that that is nice and square. Of course, you want to be square to your blade, but that should already be square. If it's not, you've got some calibration to do. We're going to bring this guy in, make our first cut, which is going to establish our first miter. Then we'll be able to turn that around to make the second cut. And a big, big piece of safety advice here. You need to use a clamp. Now, I like to use this metal match fit clamp only because it's got a really positive registration surface. So when I'm nice and flat against the front surface here, I can tell. Sometimes with these wobbly things and other types of clamping mechanisms, you can't necessarily feel whether you are clamping perfectly flat and straight on. So when I clamp this in place, I know that the piece is secure, but I'm also not causing it to kind of rotate back a little bit, which can happen if you clamp with too much pressure at the top. Right now, it does look like that blade is getting pretty close to the clamp, but it's not going anywhere. It's nice and snug, and this way I don't have to have my hands in the mix when I'm messing around with this blade. All right, so let's make that first cut. Now I can remove the clamp, flip this bad boy around, put the stop block down. I'm going to slide it over. When I make contact, I'm going to hold the piece there and bring my clamp in, apply our pressure, and now we can make the next cut. We simply repeat this process until we're all the way through our stock or we have enough segments. One, two, three, 4, 5, 6, 7, Now once your segments are cut, you want to put them together with your clamping system. Now this is a Merrill clamp available from MLCS. Really one of the best clamps on the market for something like this because it has this steel band. Bessey makes one that has a little fabric strap, but nothing works quite as good as steel when you really want to crank down on this thing. So the reason we want it in the clamps is because if you just assemble it manually, you can't really tell what's happening until there's pressure. So once I have this pressure applied, like I said, you're probably going to want to do a test run so you don't have to risk messing up your actual workpieces. But these are my actual workpieces for one of my rings. And what I'm looking for is gaps. And a consistent gap tells me that there is something that I can do to slightly change the setting. All right? Keep in mind, any change we make is like ×8, right? So you have to be careful not to overdo it. So what I'm seeing here, hopefully you could see it as well, is a little bit of a gap on almost every one of these on this inside area here. So if we have a gap there, what that tells me is back here, I need to remove a little bit of material. So I have to make an adjustment that will peel off just a little bit on my pieces. Now you can, at this point, you can go through and make that slight cut on each one of these. That's probably the best way to make sure it's absolutely consistent, but I am a little bit fearful of going too far with that because I make a slight adjustment ×8 and now I'm gonna have a gap at the back, right? So we're gonna be very careful about this. So let's head back to the table saw and we'll make a couple of small changes. Now how you make an adjustment like this, I mean this is a smidgen, and when I say a smidgen, I mean a smidgen. Like a tiny, tiny amount, and I want to take it from this area of this piece. So that means I have to take this whole arm and rotate it counterclockwise this way. So how am I going to do that? You know, there are fine adjustments here built into this, but sometimes that little smidge that I want to take is actually something that I could do just by flexing this piece a little bit. So on the back here, we've got a right angle bracket. And if I loosen this up here, watch what happens. There's not much flex, but I can get a little bit. See how I can push it forward or back and influence its position a little bit? That's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to pull back on here and then tighten it back up again. And that actually may just be that little smidgen that I need. Now I'll do a few more of these. Each one will just get a little bit of a trim. Now if you look down here, I got a little bit of pencil left over, but it's all removed from the back end. Clearly things weren't absolutely perfect before because we actually don't see the pencil all the way up here, but we're talking about minute differences here, so this should still be square enough to get the job done. But I just want to show you, we primarily removed material from this back portion over here. So I basically went through and on each segment, I cut one side and just made a slight adjustment. And when I get it back into clamps, let me get that straightened down a little bit there. All right. I get these things back together and it looks pretty darn perfect to me, or at least as perfect as it needs to be for this. So I think we'll roll with it. Now, if you do this and you still see gaps here, then you want to go back and do the other side and make sure you're going to actually shorten them as you do it, but it's better than having gaps. So this looks pretty good. And now we're ready for a glue up. So let's talk a little bit about end grain. Now end grain is notoriously difficult to glue. And when you do a miter joint, even though you're cutting on a 45, it's still mostly end grain. Think of it as a bunch of straws. So if you put a liquid on the end of those straws, it just seeps right in. So miters often are glue starved, and that's why we consider them to be fairly weak, and typically we reinforce them. So we can't reinforce this, right? Because we're gonna be doing things to make rings for our project out of this. There's no reinforcement that we can do. So we have to rely on some other methods. And one thing you can do to strengthen a glue bond of the miter is to actually pre-seal this surface. Now traditionally, you might find people will use standard wood glue diluted significantly with water. That's called glue sizing. And then you paint that onto the end grain, let that dry, and then do the final glue up afterwards. The reason I don't like to do that is because it has a lot of water in it. That water swells these fibers, makes this surface incredibly rough, and then when I put these two pieces together again, they don't join quite as nice as they did before. And you have to sand this surface, you know, quite a bit to get those pieces to be nice and smooth again, and that sanding can knock everything out of whack. So I think the water stuff is best avoided. What I'm gonna do is use a little bit of CA glue. Now the reason I like CA glue, especially this thin stuff, is there's no water in it, and it also dries very quickly and won't raise that grain. So to do this, I'm just going to put a liberal amount there, get out to the edges. Right, and I'm going to let it soak up what it wants, just for a couple of seconds, and then wipe it away. Now let that dry, and I will do this to each side of each one of my segments. Now this is kind of optional, but if you do feel a little bit of roughness, or maybe the paper towel left some, fiber there, just 2 or 3 passes with a sanding block. That's all you need to do. Now the glue I'm going to use is epoxy. Epoxy is really good for something like this, especially if you add a little bit of filler. This is just a high density filler. Makes it a little bit thicker, and it won't absorb as readily into the end grain. It's just a white powdery substance. And the epoxy I'm using right now is Total Boat. I used to use a lot of West Systems, but I'm using Total Boat now because they sent these to me. So why not use them? Let's give that a good mix. But I should say that if you are a West Systems user, you're not really missing out on anything with the Total Boat, but if you can get Total Boat at a better price or something like that, then go for it, because it's pretty much equivalent. You can see this glue's nice and thick now. I'm just going to paint the epoxy onto the end grain of each piece. I'm actually going to take a piece that's raw wood that has not been pre-treated with a CA glue, and I'm going to put the same amount of glue on it. By the time I'm done gluing all these pieces, we'll take a look and compare and see how much it's absorbed. I don't know if you could see that, but the piece that wasn't sealed, there's really hardly anything left on there. That's not a lot of adhesive to grip to the other side. But the one that was pre-sealed, you can just kind of see the epoxies still hanging out. So that's why we do it. All right, so I'm going to start to tighten this guy, tighten it down, make any adjustments I need to make. Highly recommend you have gloves on when you do this, because you are going to get your fingers in the schmutz. You can see I apply pressure, and I keep walking around, checking each joint. Tap them down if you need to. All right, and at this point, I'm actually going to take this clamp off. This was just helping it so that it doesn't move around. And before I fully tighten everything, I'm going to raise these up a little bit. I want those clamps to be centered on the blocks. It's getting there. Tighten it a little bit more. Tighten it down. Okay, so I'm going to clean off as much of the epoxy as I can. Lay down these paper towels and just kind of rest it on there. It will glue itself to the paper towels, but that's not a big deal. It looks good. Now I let these rings dry overnight, and once the glue is completely cured, you can come back and try to flatten one face. Now how you do this is up to you. It really shouldn't be that far off to begin with. I've got a few spots here, but sometimes you don't know if it's actually the glue or if it's unevenness. So you can grab some kind of a sanding block and then work your way around. This is a pretty safe way to do it. All right, so that is the first part of the ring story. The next part, we would go into getting that sucker mounted to a faceplate, hit on the lathe, and I think I told someone earlier, I misspoke. I told someone that we, in this video, would cover the lathe work and the router work. I forgot, that's the shaping, which is the next video. So We will not be showing that tonight, though. But if you're new to this, I saw a couple people were asking, is this typical of what the Guild usually offers? And it is. The Guild is all about the details. We take as much time as it takes to explain something. It's a pace that's a little different than what you might be used to if you watch a lot of tutorials on YouTube. But we like to spend time on the details, and it's more of a relaxing journey instead of a breakneck pace that makes you feel like you just got whiplash. And some of these topics are pretty intense. There's a lot of details. So we really want this to be as close to a woodworking course that you would take in person, as close as we can get to that, utilizing everything we can in the digital space to make it in some ways even better than an in-person class. Though that said, there's truly nothing better than an in-person class, but there are elements about the presentation on the Guild site that make it better. So if there are any questions, and everybody was kind of chatting along and I was typing answers when I could. So if anyone has any other questions pertaining to this or the Guild in general, I'm happy to answer them. But we're not doing like a full Q&A here or anything like that. But let me see. What's the final finish going to be? I don't know, Jacob. I'm thinking probably I'm on a Rubio kick these days, so I don't see why I would depart from that on this one. I think it'll look good. Piece like this would look good with a nice matte finish. Maybe just a little bit of satiny look to it, nice and smooth. But I am using walnut for the rings and white oak for the main structure. And I don't use a lot of white oak, but I really kind of just wanted something that would stay in that light brown, color indefinitely, and that would pair well with walnut. So I think the white oak is going to do the trick. I think it's going to be a nice, handsome combination. Anthony says, I thought it was a question at first, but he says there's also a lot of support during and after the project from the instructor or other people who have previously built it. One of the things that's a little bit tricky to do with Guild instructors is to make them understand this isn't YouTube. This isn't Instagram. This isn't something where if people ask you questions, you could be like, meh, I don't have to answer that. In the Guild, you do. And it's we got to get better at contracts. But when we have a really good contract in place, it is absolutely going to require instructors to monitor these questions. So when you put a comment into an instructor's, any one of the videos in their build, you put a comment in there, that immediately shoots off an email notification to that instructor, and they are required to answer it. Now, they're busy, right? So they may not answer it as fast as I do necessarily, but they will get the email, and most of the time they will be there within a day answering that question for you, which is pretty cool. The name of the clamp is the Merle clamp. It's M-E-R-L-E. You can find it on Amazon, or we've linked to it in a couple videos on our site, but it's also on the MLCS website. Yeah, the first idea, Gary says he likes the first idea that I had. Well, okay, I don't know whether you're talking about, because I didn't have any ideas. I have no original thought in this head of mine. The original design that Brian came up with that I started down the path of building, I like that one too. And I told Brian that as soon as this project's done, as a standalone table, that is worthy of a build. It has some similarities to this, but I love it. So, and I've already done some of the legwork to the process to make that. So I may be building that just for fun later on. Okay, so Mark, the top appears to be a little at risk the way you attach it. Floating top looks like it may not be as secure. Did you consider widening the support structure? No, and I don't think this is at any sort of risk. The table just in general is a light use table. This is not something you're going to put a lot of heavy things on to begin with. There is, let's see, the smaller table, the top isn't much wider than this, but it will have 2 points to secure it here. Where it makes contact at the top. I've got my longer one here. I don't know, it's under a bunch of stuff and I don't want to dent work that I just sanded. The other one is a little bit bigger than this. That's plenty of surface to hold it in place, especially for like an occasional table like this. It's not a dining table. So the table just in general is not going to be the most sturdy table in the world. It's not intended to be. It's more of an art piece, I would say. But built sturdier than the ones that we showed in the beginning, which just did not hold up from just regular light use, just the way some of that imported stuff goes. Yeah, I agree, Mark. Hats off to Benham and Funk. It's great. I don't consider myself a designer. I don't necessarily take any particular level, or let's say an excessive level of pride in the designs that I come up with. I think good design is a hard thing to come up with, and some people have that magic. I don't believe that I do. I like to take an idea and run with it, but a lot of times I need help with that initial idea, I should say. So having really creative people around me, like Brian, like John, I could sometimes, bounce ideas off of them and get something back that I can work with. But I don't consider myself the most creative person, and that's okay. I've always said this, I don't think my legacy will ever be the furniture that I've made. My legacy will be the teaching that I've done, and then hopefully what other people have done with that information. So I don't worry too much about things like giving credit. I love giving credit, and if somebody helps me, they're going to get credit for something like that. So it's all good. So just to sum up, this is available in the Guild. It's at thewoodwhispererguild.com. I do believe I have a link. Is that the right link? I'm going to put that in the chat room if anyone wants to jump in there. Here's the deal. These projects, we do the preview party, right, like we did tonight. Tomorrow, the project launches officially. We'll have 3 videos at launch, and then within the next 2 weeks or so, the rest of the videos will come out. It'll be done within a 3-week period. And the videos just keep going like this. They're pretty extensive. And the price on this right now is discounted. It will be discounted all day tomorrow, but then after tomorrow, the price goes back up to regular price. All right, so this way you know what you're getting, you kind of see what you're in for, what the value proposition is, and hopefully you like what you see. And if you do, go ahead and get it, because this is one of the most inexpensive projects we have in the Guild. And I'll tell you what, it turned out to be a lot more detail than I was expecting, so the price may go up even more over time if I decide that the amount of value that's in there warrants raising the price. We might do that on this one. Sometimes projects, they surprise you like that. Randy wants to know, what will you have patterns for besides the rings? Okay, so we have this pattern, right? It's definitely a green and green influence lift, but it's got a little bit of extra flair to it. We've got a pattern for the larger version of this, and then a pattern for your legs. Okay, these legs have a symmetrical, it's probably hard to see the way it is right now, but there is a symmetrical curve in here, a little bit of a flat in the center, but it flares out at the bottom, flares out at the top. So those 3 shapes will come in the hard template kit that we have, but you don't need to buy that. We will have a printable PDF. You could either print it on 8.5, 11 sheets of paper and then tape them together, or you could just take the full file. Once all this craziness is done, you can go to a FedEx shop or any other print shop and have them printed out full size, and this way you can put that onto some template material, cut it out, and do your own thing that way. Love the tables. Can you tell my wife Allison to stop playing Animal Crossing? Only if you tell my wife Nicole to stop playing Animal Crossing. Last night, sitting on the couch, Ava comes up, we're watching a little TV, she sits next to me, falls asleep. Now, Nicole usually puts Ava down, I put Mateo down. So she's got the easy night, right? Because she's already asleep. So I'm trying to text her, and the thing is, she's one wall away from me. I know she's in the next room. I've looked at the security camera to find her, and I'm like, okay, there she is. Texting her. I bought her an Apple Watch. She has an Apple Watch. She's got a phone, but I cannot get in touch with this woman. So eventually I had to just kind of figure out how to lift this kid and get up and start walking with her upstairs. And I'm like, can you help me? I'm trying not to wake up Ava. And she's there with her little Switch playing Animal Crossing. She was having a good old time. Not paying any attention to anything else going on. Oh, good stuff. Yeah. Okay, so little clarification on the templates. I did not put the circle templates with the templates specific for this project because the circle templates are not absolutely necessary unless you want to do the router table method. The template kit that we sell for circles is a full circle kit. You only need 2 of them, but I can't take them apart. It's just super inefficient for me to just take 2 out of there and break a set to put into this other kit. So if you want the circle thing, you have to get the circle templates, and if you want the template kit specifically for this project, that's a separate thing, but those are 2 items. The circle templates I actually think is a really good buy. It's something that my buddy Ron made for me a long time ago, well before I had CNC. This was back in Arizona. He was doing a project. He goes, hey man, I just batched out a whole bunch of these circle templates. Do you want them? And I've been using those for years and trying to because I know not everyone has these, I hesitate to show them on the show. But there's so many times I'll break out these templates because you need circles of all different diameters. So this is a full set, every inch from I think from 3 to 12 inches or something like that. So anyway, that is the kit we recommend if you want to go the circle route. But you don't have to have that. You can make circles in your shop. You don't necessarily need it, but it is a good shortcut if that's what you're into. Okie dokie. When's the basic series start? Great question, Greg. I really wanted to start that very soon. I got to tell you, I didn't think that this whole pandemic thing would impact me here work-wise because, we don't really have traffic here or anything like that, but things really snowballed quickly. And we're at the point now that Jason isn't even coming in, and I got a lot of balls rolling coming back from Workbench Con, super energized, and now those balls are still rolling, and I don't have anybody here to help me. So that is one of the things that's on hold until I can free up some time. Right now, I'm spending half of my day packing templates in the basement, which is, it's an absolute blast doing that, let me tell you. Okie dokie. So I think that's about it. Thank you so much, everybody, for hanging out. Glad you were able to check out this project. It's very interesting to see what's going to happen in the guild. I don't know. I had trips planned this year, so we had some great projects coming down the line, and some of my plans have already been canceled. I had to cancel with Daryl Parrott. That needs to be rescheduled. With Jory, that's supposed to come up. Philip Morley is supposed to be coming up in the May, June, July timeframe. I don't know what the heck is going to happen at this point. I can promise you, worst case scenario, you'll get more projects from me, maybe another one from Matt. But if we can't travel, we can't travel. So, but we'll do our best. Okay. There is currently no discount code. The project is already discounted, Norman. All right. Thanks, everybody. Stay healthy. And I just hope everybody comes out of this, in good shape. This is really messy stuff. But I have to say the woodworking community has been, how do I put it? Watching my feeds, it's been an absolute pleasure. People are posting in a different way. It just feels like the vibe has changed as a result of this global situation that we're all dealing with. And it is one small sliver of a positive that's coming out of this that I enjoy seeing happen. So anyway, good community stuff. All right, have a great night, everybody. Thank you for stopping by. And I'll talk to you later. Bye.